Welcome to everyone. I'm Stephen Irwin, the chair of Slynn Foundation. I've got to begin with the obligatory bathos of telling you that in the unlikely event of a fire, you need to leave by that door and go to High Holborn. And please, will you turn off all your phones? Don't use them, don't record. Please make sure they're off, not silent, but off. We are very pleased to be able to welcome the four speakers who've agreed to help us tonight. The position is that we have real experts to talk about this problem. Without enforcement, any system of law is merely a set of aspirations. That proposition, I think, is supported by what happened to the supposed trial for war crimes after the First World War and to the failure of the League of Nations. And so with fundamental laws, such as those reflected in international humanitarian law, enforcement can only come either from the relevant state concerned or from sufficient enforcement by international effort. And otherwise, we face impunity, which I'm sure that none of us who support the rule of law will wish to see. So, four really major contributions coming to you. Firstly, on my left is Simon Smith, CMG, who's formerly the British Ambassador to Ukraine from 2012 to 2015, and who has, before that, experience of diplomatic work in Moscow. And he will, and poor fellow, if it was uncertain enough before the end of last week, it's even doubly more uncertain now, will give us some sense of what the diplomatic and military conditions may be when dealing with the enforcement of law may arise. Secondly, online, we will have Mr. aAndriy Kostin, Prosecutor General of Ukraine. He was elected to that post in July 2022. He's an experienced lawyer coming from Odessa, and he's was a member of the International Bar Association Council from 2013 to 2015, then a member of Parliament, and has become the Prosecutor General by being elected to that post by the Parliament in Ukraine. After him, we will hear from Justice Stanislav Kravchenko, the very recently elected President of the Supreme Court of Ukraine. Now, Justice Kravchenko does not speak English, so we will hear from him in Ukrainian, and then we will have a translation of what he has said. I'm sorry that it's going to be a little stilted in that way, but that's the only way he could make the contribution that he was very keen to do to this event. And then finally, we're very glad to have with us the Attorney General, Victoria Prentis, KC. It's extremely good of her to give time to come here. The attorney has 2 or 3 special qualifications for talking about this problem. Apart from her engagement as an attorney, she was the first British MP to offer a Ukrainian refugee a home, and has done so consistently since that problem arose. And I hope that the attorney will give us her views on how this country and the other powers in the West can support the rule of law in the context of the end of this crisis. The attorney needs to leave at about 7:10 or very soon after.
7:30.
So you can see how good it is of her to come here, to be here in person, having to charge away. We hope at the end we will be able to deal with some questions. I think Mr. Kostin has said he will give a little time when he finishes to questions, and we'll try and incorporate that. So that's the plan, and I'm going to ask Simon Smith to begin.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that my expertise does not lie kind of smack in the middle of the sort of legal and justice questions that preoccupy you and that are the subject of our meeting tonight. So I'll try and make this really quick, but I wanted to share with you just a few perceptions about the current state of Russia's war on Ukraine, about a few conclusions, maybe tentative conclusions that we might draw from that, and also to look a little bit about the likely shifts or the likely developments in the positions of countries whose support is essential to Ukraine in winning this war. And then finally to finish off with a little bit of a question about what the implications of that are for the questions of how to achieve justice post-war in Ukraine. So very quickly, I'll start with the latest news, as it were, and to reflect on what happened over the last couple of days in Russia. I would distill one or two basic points from it. One, I think that Putin has made a really serious climb down here. He was in public talking about treachery and inescapable punishment, and then a few hours later, those were words that he had to eat. I think one of the most important elements of his confrontation with Prigozhin is that Prigozhin was able to get out in public in Russia a challenge to Putin's version as to why he started the war on Ukraine. And I think that's not to be underestimated, because the Russian news media will have been instructed to do its best not to let that cat, once it's out of the bag, run very far around the streets of Russia, but it will run, and it will get around, and it will be something that spreads amongst Russian people. Which brings me to my, I think, what I draw as the really key point of this episode, which is that it shows that the stress that Russia is being subjected to, the pressure which Russia is under from Ukraine, from the coalition of countries supporting Ukraine, is really telling. What we've seen is evidence of an administration and a president under severe stress, and to an extent, I think, I would argue that we have seen some sort of a reply to those who say that sanctions don't work. It's not just about sanctions in Russia. There is obvious military pressure on Russia. There are other kinds of economic pressure on Russia. There are decisions taken by many countries drastically to reduce their commercial dependencies on Russia. And it all adds up to a campaign of increasing the costs to Russia of sustaining its war on Ukraine and putting its decision makers under stress. And I think what we've seen, as I say, is very much a picture of a country and institutions under stress, and I very much hope that that will be a trend that continues. One more background factor which I'd like to mention, and in a very different aspect of our thoughts about Ukraine and what to do with Ukraine and for Ukraine looking forward, many of you will know that the Ukraine Recovery Conference was held last week. I don't want to talk about recovery, that's a separate issue, but we saw at the Recovery Conference, I think, about 18 representatives, most of them at foreign minister level, one or two presidents, prime ministers, and so on, but representatives of a wide range of the countries supporting Ukraine in their defense against Russian aggression. And I think that's a very good opportunity to gauge which arguments are sort of receding and which are coming to the fore. And one of the arguments which I think has had a bearing on the discussion about what can be done to achieve a post-war justice in Ukraine are the arguments like we should make sure that we don't humiliate Russia. That now seems to have disappeared from the screen. We should be prepared to enter into compromises in order to achieve a negotiated peace. Now that one, as I'll say a bit later, I think will come back. But I sensed from the speakers at the Recovery Conference last week that there is a much more robust degree of conviction that this is a war that needs to be won. And that means that, in a sense, the sort of qualification to that, the idea and the argument that says, well, you know, wars always end with compromises, so we have to find compromises. They always end in negotiations, so we have to have some negotiating thing. We have to find a negotiating bone to throw to Putin that will make it easier to achieve peace. I think that has somewhat receded for the time being. So a distinct hardening of tone and a great deal less of the sort of argument that says sooner or later there'll have to be a negotiated peace and compromises will be needed to end the war. All that being said, however, I do envisage that as and when an end to this war looks in sight, those arguments will naturally come back. It is, and in some ways, it's perfectly right that they should. And you know, one argument that I can foresee later, somewhere down the line, is one that says, look, the main thing is if you can achieve the restoration of Ukraine's territories as of the 1991 borders, then some kind of pragmatic leniency on questions of justice and impunity may have to be contemplated and digested. So I can see that argument coming back. It's receded for now, but it will come back. I don't myself advocate that sort of pragmatism, but I think it's distinctly possible that the publics, and as I'm sure our colleague from the British government will tell us, the publics are really important in this. If you have public opinion saying, come on, we've supported this war a long time, please do not tell us that we need to stick out indefinitely because only a perfect solution is the acceptable one, and that a sort of doable, satisfactory solution is not good enough. I can see that pressure arising in the future. And in many ways, that will not be a new question. The sort of peace versus justice question is not a new one to people looking at arrangements to bring conflict to an end. But I see that it's probable that this question will re-emerge. It's a question that will arise as we get to that point where efforts to end Russia's war on Ukraine are gathering momentum. And for that reason, I think that in continuing to develop ideas and approaches on this question of a just peace, it's important to focus on that question of what will the post-war conditions need to be, what sort of peace needs to be achieved in order for it to be realistic to envisage a wide-ranging capacity to bring perpetrators to justice. And how is this going to happen if it's being done with a post-war Russian Federation administration, which may very well not be cooperative in that effort? That's, I think, where I'll leave it. Thank you very much for listening politely.
Thank you very much, Simon. We will, I hope, have the opportunity to put questions to Simon later on. Well, I wonder if we can now join up with Mr. Kostin in Ukraine.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes. We can.
Okay.
Good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for this opportunity, and good evening to everyone. Dear Right Honorables, Sir Stephen Irwin and Attorney General Prentis, Chief Justice Kravchenko, and respected audience. I'm grateful for this opportunity and looking forward to a fruitful discussion. The hope of impunity is the greatest inducement to do the wrong. Those are the wise words of Marcus Tullius Cicero that have not lost its relevance and merit in today's world. It's now more than 16 months since Russia initiated the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February 2022. This should not have, however, come as a surprise for the civilized world. The very least, actions of Kremlin for the last 2 decades being consequential, repeatedly undermining human rights and rule of law-based international order, reigniting Russia's aspiration of becoming an alternative center of power. In recent history, we have witnessed that with Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, its annexation of Crimea in 2014, continuous war in Donbass, and its brutal engagement in Syria. In all these cases, Russia's leadership disregarded international law, leading to the most blatant act of aggression and largest armed conflict in Europe since the Second World War. Therefore, it is not merely our, Ukraine's war, but a global war that is putting international peace and security at risk. This raises legitimate questions. How should we respond? What is the best suited solution for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the whole world? For us, answer is simple and clear. Firstly, we need to stop the war of aggression by liberating occupied territories, consequently reinstating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the rules and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. And second, we need to put an end to impunity fueled by Russian regime, as well as bring justice to victims and survivors of the atrocities. Since today's panel is dedicated to the impunity after Ukraine, I would focus on the latter aspect. From the very first day of the war, we, Ukrainians, firmly believed in the prominence of justice for Russia's actions as a state, as well as for each and every individual involved in atrocities committed on behalf of Russia in Ukraine. It necessitated multifaceted response on national as well as international level in close cooperation with our partners, including United Kingdom. We recognize that Ukraine has a primary obligation to end impunity for the most serious crimes of concern, and we remain committed to undertake all necessary measures in line with international law. We seek to ensure justice and accountability through an intrinsic web of accountability in several ways. First, by investigating and prosecuting the crime of aggression, the leadership crime, the initiation of which preceded and opened the gate to all other atrocities we have witnessed and which continue. Ukraine is well aware of the limitations posed by the international law rules for prosecuting leaders who formulate or execute the act of aggression before the national courts. Therefore, closing of an accountability gap for the crime of aggression through establishment of an ad hoc special international tribunal represents the most legitimate solution and response towards Russia's impunity. We see increasing support for the idea. European Union, Council of Europe, and large number of states, known as the core group of states, advocating establishment of the special tribunal. The setup of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, ICPA, is a very first step in the right direction. Next week, we would officially launch the ICPA in The Hague. Second, by investigating and prosecuting the crime of genocide and crimes against humanity as a part of the Kremlin's well-planned policy to deny Ukraine its sovereignty and statehood and Ukrainians of their identity. The atrocities, evidence of massacres in Bucha, Sumy, Chernihiv, Izium, Kherson, and other liberated cities, along with the forcible deportation and transfer of at least 20,000 Ukrainian children, being a testament of this barbaric plan. In Russia, Ukrainian children are stripped of Ukrainian nationality, adopted into Russian families, and forced to undergo so-called re-education into Russian. For teenager boys, it often includes militarization programs. Russia is openly robbing us of our future, children. This policy is also heavily implemented by Russia in occupied territories through so-called re-education programs, which aims to subjugate Ukrainian identity through Russification process. Third, by investigating and prosecuting war crimes that are piling up on a daily basis, with over 92,000 registered incidents of war crimes, ranging from indiscriminate shelling of civilians and civilian objects, willful killing, torture and ill treatment, conflict-related sexual violence, unlawful confinement, forced displacement, and pillage on massive scale. For us, the international dimension of cooperation is built on the notion of the synergy with the leading justice institution, International Criminal Court, and all players involved, so that we secure a comprehensive web of accountability, eliminating any opportunity of safe havens for war criminals. Undoubtedly, Putin's arrest warrant is a historic decision by the ICC that marks the beginning of the enforcement of justice and accountability for Ukraine on the international level. It demonstrates that no one is or should be above the law. At the same time, it is an exceptional example of the complementarity, whereas we, national authorities, are paralyzed to investigate and prosecute Putin due to his personal immunity. We see ICC stepping forward with the Office of the Prosecutor acting in a speedy and efficient manner. Now, priority is to ensure state cooperation so that the war criminal, Putin, is surrendered to the ICC. We also greatly value efforts by third states, members of the Joint Investigation Team, as well as 24 countries that initiated domestic investigations for international crimes committed in Ukraine. Another layer of accountability stems from sanctions regime undertaken against Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian individuals and entities, including financial institutions and banks, oligarchs, proxies, or organized armed groups closely tied to the aggressor, Russian Federation, including the terrorist organization Wagner Group, known for its vicious activities throughout the world. Sanctions can and do in practice recede Russia's and its facilitators' abilities to wage this war. Damage and destruction caused by Russia continues as we speak. According to the World Bank estimates, the overall reconstruction and recovery needs of Ukraine is around $411 billion United States dollars. Therefore, establishment of the register of damage through an enlarged partial agreement for reparation purposes is an integral part of the redress owed to Ukraine, victims and survivors of this war. Lastly, let me use this opportunity to convey our sincere gratitude to the United Kingdom for your unwavering and continuous support to Ukraine and to my office. We deeply value the financial contributions through the Multilateral Accountability Initiative, the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, as well as strategic advice provided by the UK experts. At the same time, we deeply value commitments and efforts by Right Honourable Attorney General Prentis. Dear Victoria, thank you for your personal engagement and contribution in our quest for justice and accountability. Since the war started, the air raid siren has become something every person, every child living in Ukraine became acquainted with on a daily basis. It results into stress and terror, but most importantly, genuine fear that one might be hit by a bomb. Undeniably, it is part of the culture of impunity, whereas Russia believes that the whole Ukraine is a theater of war, while Ukrainian people expendable casualties. Amidst such war, Ukrainian people await for justice and redress. We do not have other alternative but to act and to hold the perpetrators accountable as means to end impunity. Thank you, my dear colleagues, for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kostin. Now, Mr. Kostin has indicated that he will have to leave us, but he will take a couple of questions before he leaves us. I wonder if there's anyone from the audience who would like to ask him a question. Well, I'm going to ask one, and then, since there's silence for a moment, and yes, I will bring in Joshua. You mentioned the core group of states whose assistance you would seek in setting up a special tribunal, an ad hoc tribunal. Can you say a little bit more about how you see that progressing, what sort of timescale you anticipate, and what is the, what might be thought the fulcrum of support, the tipping point when that will become a real prospect? Can you help us a little on how that will develop?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, this is one of the most important layers of our web of accountability. And it's important not only, I mean, the creation of special tribunal important is not only for Ukraine and for Ukrainians, because all Ukrainians want to see Putin in the dock of the special tribunal for the aggression he initiated and which is now, unfortunately, proceeded. The other element, very important, of the special tribunal is the strength of the international community and its real commitment, collective commitment of all civilized world to prosecute and to punish the aggressor for the act of aggression. The third element, very important, of the special tribunal is the deterrent element. Because now some other potential aggressors very attentively look at the collective response of the civilized world for the act of aggression. And it's important, taking into account these three elements, to collectively create special tribunal, which will have jurisdiction over the so-called Troika, the incumbent president of Russian Federation, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs. This is critically important for Ukrainians, and this is critically important to restore the world-based rule-based international order. If we come back and look at the prospects of special tribunal, let's say 8 months ago, there was no official supporters on the international level. There was only discussion and only, I would say, message from Ukrainian that this tribunal should be established in order to fill in the gap of accountability. Now we have more than 35, I would say, countries who believe that special tribunal need to be created in order, once again, not only to prosecute and to punish for the crime of aggression initiated by
Russian military and political leadership, but also to deter any future aggressor from the aggression. The discussion is now shifted from the political necessity to legal modalities. I would say very frankly that these two elements of the discussion are very closely tied. And from our point of view, the political commitment and political will and strength and I would say bravery of the civilized world to join Ukraine in creation of special tribunal, the real tribunal, which could prosecute and punish Putin, is extremely essential and could not be replaced by long-going, very smart and very difficult legal discussions. With full respect to my colleagues, lawyers, we absolutely understand that based, for instance, on international treaty, we are free to create any model of tribunal which could prosecute and punish Putin. Nonetheless, we fully respect that in order to take political decision, the lawyers can or need to help their governments to be strong and brave. Therefore, the discussion is ongoing, and my position is that we need better solution than rapid solution. So my understanding is that we have time to discuss the specific legal solutions which could be in between the position of the so-called internationalized tribunal, quite interesting formula, and the international tribunal Ukraine wants to be created. I believe that this discussion will be fruitful and lawyers will help politicians to take very, I would say, important decision that political and military leadership of Russia should be effectively prosecuted and punished for the crime of aggression on international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to allow one more question. Joshua, do you want to put a question?
Thank you very much indeed.
Joshua
My name
Rosenberg.
is Joshua Rosenberg. I understand what you say about the need to deter others from committing the crime of aggression, but the tribunal will be successful only if people are charged and tried and convicted. How are you going to get Putin and the other members of the Troika in front of this tribunal?
There are no easy questions from London, are there?
I used to answer this question, and my answer is usually consists of two elements. First element, I would say that the history and some of our experts who are now world-known and respected experts in international criminal law, they started their career in tribunals like ICTY. And many of them very openly told me that when they started their work as young lawyers in these tribunals, they never imagined that people like Milosevic or Karadzic would be captured and put at the dock. They just did their job. God knows when and how war will be ended. We Ukrainians believe that this war will be ended by our victory. But what is important for us lawyers is to prepare everything now, in time, before we can't wait when and if we can capture Putin and his entourage. It's important for us to prepare the case now, when we have all of the evidences. And it's important for us to have support of our partners and friends in this endeavor. And second, you know, history says, and history teaches us, that tyrannies which existed for decades may fall at one day. We could not build our strategy on it, but let's not exclude this possibility. So for us lawyers, it's important to do our job, to prepare the case, to collect evidences, to have indictments prepared, and then I think we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that Mr. Kostin will be able to hang on with us, and we may at the end be able to ask another question and get a contribution. Because of the pressures on the attorney's time, I'm going to change the order of events and ask her to go next, because I don't want to put her under such pressure that she has to leave in the middle. So could I welcome her contribution next? And,
I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm negotiating with the whips hard, but as you all know, when there's a deadline, there's a deadline. Thank you, Sir Stephen. This is a very important event, and thank you very much for organising it and putting it on. As you alluded to at the beginning, Ukraine is very important to me personally. We've had Vika living with us since last March, and we love her very much, and we're very pleased that she's with us, but we also wish she could go home. My daughter lived in Kiev before the war. We were very fortunate that we could bring her home shortly before the outbreak of war. And we grew to love, during the time that she was there in particular, many Ukrainians and Ukrainian society in general. And it's fair to say that I have also formed many relationships with my Ukrainian governmental colleagues over the time I've been in office. And it is lovely to see aAndriy, who has become a very good friend over the last, well, really 8 months or so, and as are others of his colleagues in government, the Agriculture Minister, the Justice Minister, and others, to name but a few. We are united in our wish to see Russia held accountable for its actions. And it's fair to say that I have seen the work that aAndriy is doing firsthand, and one of the most extraordinary events that we appeared at together was we jointly laid a wreath in Bucha this year on the anniversary of the atrocities that took place in Bucha. And this was an extraordinary event. Bucha, you will all remember, I'm afraid all too vividly, the pictures of the pit of bodies, 118 of them, I think, women and children and some men, last year, and the mud around that pit and the devastation around it and the instruments of torture that were found and so on. Bucha this year was clean, tidy, and road, nice houses, a beautiful church, freshly painted in white, with a fantastic internationally organised exhibition, which had some fairly unpleasant photographs in it, but it was all beautifully and tastefully done. There were plans for a memorial garden. There's a place to lay a wreath. And most importantly, for lawyers, I think, the prosecutions of some of those who committed the atrocities had already taken place 1 year on. People had been convicted in trials which the NGO community and others watching around the world had found to be perfectly fair, and they had people in prison, and also prisoners that they've used in prisoner swaps. I have been overwhelmingly impressed by the strength and the courage and the skill of aAndriy and his team. Their work must frankly seem never-ending, and it's always good, sort of, to get an update from him. But we were recently talking about numbers of crimes that started with a 5, then a 6, then a 7, and today we hear 92,000. Those numbers increase every day and still continue to do that. I think it must be an enormous weight on aAndriy's shoulders and those of his team to feel that he is they are trying to deliver justice, not only for their own people, but also for the world and the international rules-based order, as he said. So I do think as an international community, we have a duty to share that burden. We know that the government's committed to supporting Ukraine. We have given a large amount of military, humanitarian, economic support, more than 6 billion from government to government. And we've also, I hope, been able to support on a personal level our governmental colleagues, those in the civil service, and we're very much helping with the collection of evidence. And we've got one of our best international judges, Sir Howard Morrison, training Ukrainian judges. We've now trained well over 100. That work is ongoing. It's something we're very interested in. I know that many members of the bar are keen to help, and from the solicitor's profession, some of that help has already started, some is yet to be envisaged. We are particularly going to help with defence work, which of course is important too. So we are helping. And last week, as has been said, we hosted the Ukrainian Recovery Conference, which galvanized help of about $60 billion from around the world. But I think as lawyers, we all know that justice and accountability can't really be measured in dollars or in hryvnia. It is deeper, and it's about putting things right. So it is a currency, but it's a sort of intangible currency. And there are some very difficult questions. Already the questions this evening have got right to the heart of why this is difficult. With the International Tribunal, we have challenges about justiciability. We have challenges of troika immunity. We are part of that group of countries who've joined the court group who are seeking to work through those challenges. We also, and you'll have seen perhaps reported today and over recent weeks, we're considering how we look at the sanctions regime, what we do with the frozen assets, what is being done in the EU with some of the assets in the bank there, and the different positions of our friends in the EU. We're not sure quite how we can do this, and I think it's fair to say that I don't have answers today, but what is sure is that we are working through these questions as collaboratively as we can with our friends in the G7, in the EU, and frankly across the world. It's very important that when talking about international accountability, we try to make sure that that is countries from around the world join in where we can manage that. What I am sure about is that this will happen and that we need to help it happen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, again, kick things off, if I may. Late next year, there are 2 presidential elections scheduled, one in Russia, one in the United States. Of course, I can't ask you to predict the result of either, but let's think of that as a platform. How do you read the solidarity and determination across the supportive nations to Ukraine? And how would that change if there was a change of party in the White House?
Well, I think you probably ought to look the other way for analysis of international affairs.
Don't worry, I'll ask him in the end.
Okay, yeah. I'll just stick to the law, which is, I think actually, as we saw at the weekend, things can happen very quickly. And one of my international legal friends, very, very senior international legal friend, might have texted me on Saturday morning and said, right, I'm going in. He didn't, and it didn't happen on Saturday. But there might well come a time when it might. And I think aAndriy made the point very, very powerfully himself, which is that we as lawyers need to stand ready for that time, and we need to have all our complicated legal arguments in advance, if possible, of the moment when international accountability may move to a place where we can actually have trials. What is so impressive about aAndriy's work is that trials are going on right now every day in Ukraine. And after all, given that 99.5% of this work, or 99% at least, will be done in Ukraine by Ukrainian judges, I think that's something we can and are and should lean in to support right now. It's very easy to get drawn into enormous hypotheticals, but I'm not going to. What I would say, though, is that the support, and I think I can say this from a political point of view, the support from the British public has been absolutely extraordinary and unwavering. I now live in a village that is 10% Ukrainian, and we love it. And the mayor of Mariupol is visiting the town I represent, Banbury, next week on the 11th, and everybody's coming to see him. In fact, we're having a problem because we haven't got enough space for the people who want to come and see him. So as far as I can take the political temperature in this country, the support is very, very strong and totally unwavering. I also get the impression, because obviously I talk very extensively to AGs and to justice ministers around the world, I get the impression that in most of our friends and allies that support is also very strong, particularly in the G7, also in places that we had not previously seen that support, that sort of internationalist support, but it's very, very much there. So I'm hopeful, which doesn't really answer your question.
Well, thank you. And other questions for the attorney now. We'll see how we go with Justice Kravchenko in a moment. But just while we do definitely have her here, anyone else? Yes. Perhaps you could tell us who you are and what your background is.
Thank you very much. I'm Professor Roman Majdanik. Let me ask you, dear patron, today in Ukraine, we have a set of the Ukrainian court's decisions.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you. I'm not sure the microphone is on, because certainly it is, right. Can you all hear the question? Can you speak up? It's
just now we have a couple, not more, set of the Ukrainian decisions about the compensation of the loss of the damages against Russian aggressor state. But we haven't any such decisions which would be recognized and enforced on any overseas jurisdictions. My question is, under which conditions, for example, under the English law, could we have such positive result? Thank you.
So with the question of compensation and reparations generally, we are working very closely internationally, and aAndriy is part of this conversation with friends and allies from around the world. Many of those have different legal systems, different property rights, different views as to whether the interest on assets is part of the original asset, for example. So we've been watching very carefully and speaking very closely. In fact, I'm speaking to my colleague in Canada later this week, what is going on around the world with different forms of I think compensation is perhaps the loosest way of putting it. In Canada, as you know, there have been a series of legal judgments which have not really gone our way. In America, there is some interesting work, but again, we're not there. There's interesting developments from Belgium as well with the interest in the bank. So we're working together, but not but within each of our own jurisdictions, I think is probably the best way of explaining what's going on at the moment. The biggest development, I think, at the moment in the compensation space is the setting up of the Register of Damages, which has been mentioned by the Council of Europe. I think it's interesting that that body is setting it up. I think it's interesting that it's going to be co-located in Kyiv, which I think is right. And I think it's good that that is being set up in as internationalist, if I can coin a phrase, way as possible, because then I think it will have maximum reach. I'm sorry I can't give any real answers right now. I can't because this work is difficult, which is not a word we ever try to use about the compensation space, but I mean, all of us know that it is. But it is important that we work collaboratively while recognising that we come from different places.
Thank you. Well, I'm very grateful. I think probably we should move to hear from Justice Kravchenko
I will
now.
do a runner if that's
Well,
all right.
thank you very much indeed for coming along.
you.
We're very grateful. Welcome. Welcome, Justice Kravchenko. We look forward to hearing from you.
Уже добрий вечір, високоповажні учасники форуму. Радий вітати всіх на форумі «Безкаральність та події в Україні». Щиро дякую фонду лорда Сліна за запрошення взяти участь в форумі, тим більше, що тема, яка піднята сьогодні, дуже актуальна для українських правників. Ще більш нам приємно, що захід проводить наш давній партнер, Фундація європейського права лорда Сліна, з яким у нас була дуже гарна співпраця в минулі роки. Ми раді продовженню її сьогодні, коли Україна перебуває у пеклі війни, розпочатої Росією. Таке партнерство є важливим, актуальним, щоб усі українці мали доступ до справедливого та неупередженого правосуддя, а правова система в Україні була здатна ефективно захищати права і свободи всіх громадян навіть у воєнний час. Принагідно, я хочу щиро подякувати народу та уряду Сполученого Королівства за всю допомогу, експертну, технічну, гуманітарну, яку вони надають Україні, та сподіваюся на подальшу плідну співпрацю в ці непрості для України часи. Ми повинні докласти усіх зусиль, аби перемогла демократія і справедливість, аби панувало верховенство міжнародного права, аби була перемога добра над злом. Тепер хотів би перейти до проблем, з якими зіткнулася правова система України на фоні відкритої агресії і вчинення воєнних злочинів. Після початку повномасштабного вторгнення Російської Федерації на територію України та оголошення на терені нашої держави воєнного стану перед судовою системою поставили нові виклики, що пов'язані із здійсненням правосуддя в воєнних умовах. Попри такі виклики та труднощі, з якими стикається судова система під час війни, констатуємо, що загалом суди працюють у штатному режимі, здійснюючи правосуддя та розглядаючи справи, в тому числі про воєнні злочини, звичайно, за винятком тимчасово окупованих територій. На окремих викликах, з якими зіткнулася судова система під час розгляду воєнних злочинів, хотілося б зупинитись детально. Перший виклик – це наше законодавство. Кримінальний кодекс України мав норми, які визначали категорії злочинів щодо миру, людяності та світового правопорядку. Але ми собі уявити не могли, що можемо зіткнутися з такою кількістю злочинів. Так, за даними Офісу Генерального прокурора, станом на 15 червня у нас обліковано 93 564 воєнних злочинів. І за кожним таким випадком проводяться активні слідчі дії з метою зафіксувати всі обставини, пошкодження, визначили код потерпілих, на жаль, і загиблих, ідентифікувати їх, також зафіксувати питання спричинення шкоди. Станом на 26 червня 2023 року до національних судів вже надійшло більше 1100 таких проваджень. Частина з них розглянута, частина навіть розглянута в апеляційному порядку. Перші справи вже розглянуті касаційним судом і розпочалась фаза активного формування практики. Що ж це за категорії злочинів і чому вони незвичайні для України? Ми ніколи собі не могли уявити, що зіткнемося з таким явищем, як порушення законів та звичаїв війни. Що таке пропаганда війни, що таке найманство, що таке планування, підготовка і розв'язання агресивної війни. Але всіми цими питаннями нам треба займатися, але національне законодавство побудовано таким чином, що відносить більшості до норм міжнародного права, І фактично вже при формуванні обвинувачення ми повинні виходити з тих критеріїв, що таке ж визначались у певних конвенціях і як їм нам правильно застосовувати. Наступне питання і другий виклик – це дефіцит суддівських кадрів. Так склалось в Україні, що перед війною ми мали цю проблему, а та ситуація, де окуповані території, де суди знаходяться в зоні безпосередніх бойових дій, і тут не може здійснюватись правосуддя. І довелось законодавцю спішно змінювати певні норми і дозволити переміщення суддів із непідконтрольних територій на контрольні України, звідси відрядження суддів. Але ж питання не тільки в судах, питання і в інших учасників процесу. Треба забезпечити і підтримання обвинувачення, і захист учасників процесу і свідків, бо ми чітко розуміємо те, що судові рішення в Україні, незважаючи на надзвичайно складну ситуацію, повинні бути справедливими з огляду на міжнародне право, з огляду на рішення Європейської конвенції з прав людини. І, власне, це на сьогоднішній день наше основне завдання. Як забезпечити ті високі стандарти, але в таких складних умовах. Звідси безпека як учасників процесу, суддів, взагалі питання стоїть на кону, що є реальна загроза і по місту Києву, і по іншим регіонам України. Також третім викликом це ми можемо говорити, що в зв'язку з окупацією була змінена велика кількість суддів, які не могли здійснювати правосуддя. Таких нараховувалось 130, але певна частина України вже деокуповано, і роботу 51 суду відновлено. Певний період у нас не працювала Вища рада правосуддя, і тому законодавець ці повноваження віддав голові Верховного суду. Але на сьогоднішній день ми з дуже великою приємністю можемо констатувати той факт, що і Вища рада правосуддя працює, і запрацювала Вища кваліфкомісія, яким і надано повноваження щодо відрядження суддів, визначення територій суддів, і, власне, інші організаційні питання. Також окреме питання в нас виникло на деокупованих територіях, де ми відновили роботу суддів. Зокрема, в силу того, що певні провадження, як кримінальні, цивільні, так були втрачені, або виникло питання повернення тих проваджень, які були передавались в суди, і треба їх повертати, але з цією ситуацією ми справляємося. Таким чином, хочу констатувати, що після оголошення в Україні воєнного стану суди України стикнули з багатьма труднощами організаційного, кадрового, матеріально-технічного, змістовного та іншого характеру. Звісно, формат роботи суддів та суддів зазнав суттєвих змін у сучасний період дій воєнного стану, але все більше і більше суддів адаптуються до функціонування в нових умовах воєнного стану, і судді продовжують працювати для ефективного здійснення правосуддя. Така загальна картина. Дякую за увагу.
Dear participants, I will interpret to Justice Kravchenko as coordinator of many Slynn Foundation projects. Glad to be with all of you, and greetings to Simon and all participants, and what Justice Kravchenko has kindly shared with us. So, dear participants, I'm glad to greet everyone at the forum Impunity after Ukraine. Many thanks to the Slynn Foundation for the invitation. This topic is very relevant for the Ukrainian lawyers today, and the host is our long-standing partner, the Slynn Foundation, which is a very good partner, and we had collaboration over the years. What happened during this time is, unfortunately, we have the vortex of the war started by Russia, and so now it is very important to have such a partnership. It's when Ukraine should be able to provide access to fair and impartial justice and the legal system in Ukraine, should continue to provide the rights and freedoms to the citizens, even in wartime. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the people and the government of the UK for all the expertise, technical and humanitarian aid which they provide to Ukraine, and I hope for further fruitful cooperation in those difficult times. We must make every effort for victory of good over evil, so that democracy and justice and supremacy of international law prevail. As for the judicial system's ability to handle criminal justice for war crimes, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia and declaration of martial law in Ukraine, the judicial system faced new challenges related to the administration of justice in wartime. Despite that, we know that in general, courts work normally, administering justice and hearing cases, including on war crimes. Of course, the exception of temporarily occupied territories, and I would like to mention the individual challenges faced by the judicial system during the examination of war crimes in more detail. The first challenge relates to the fact that the courts were not ready to consider this particular category of criminal offenses. It is worth noting that the number of criminal proceedings on war crimes increases exponentially every month, and we are talking about both registered criminal trials and the trials that have been and cases that have been submitted to local courts and reviewed by the courts of appeal. So, according to statistics of the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, currently we have almost 100,000 war crimes registered, and in each such case, active investigation actions are carried out and determining the victims and those who are guilty. No less important is the issue of compensation, and our procedural legislation is structured in such a way that it is controlled by investigative judges, so the judicial system is involved in this process from the very beginning. Since February 2022, local courts received more than 1,100 criminal cases for the offenses against peace, human safety, and international legal order, according to the Chapter 20 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. About 800 criminal trials have been already done, so it's about 71% of the total, and about 300 remain still under consideration. The courts of most regions of Ukraine are involved in such trials, and during this period, local courts tried many criminal cases with the verdicts on the following war crimes: violation of the laws and customs of war, Article 438 of the Criminal Code. It's 125 cases, 11% of all, under Chapter 20 of the Code of Ukraine. 36 cases, 29% of the total. It is propaganda of war. Article 436 of the Criminal Code. 16 cases were submitted and 11 were tried. Mercenary cases, Article 447. 5 criminal cases, of which 3 were tried. Planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of an aggressive war, Article 437. 3 cases are pending. Since February 2022, the General Appeals Courts reviewed a total of 39 criminal cases on appeals of criminal offenses against peace, human safety, and international legal order. Despite the fact that the Chapter 20 that considers such cases existed in the criminal code from the start, the judges did not have enough experience on such criminal offenses, and in the peacetime there were no training of judges regarding the war crimes trials. In April 2022, it was clear that we have a significant number of new categories of cases, war crimes, and several cases of the crime of aggression came before the full-scale invasion. One case was considered by the Grand Chamber, but it's still unresolved. In particular, there was a question about resolution and conduct of an aggressive war. The problem concerns the fact who can be considered as the subject of the aggressive war. Is it the president of the aggressor country? Is it the Minister of Defense? Is it a particular officer or soldier who participates in hostilities and conducts de facto this aggressive war? There is no easy answer to this question in the legislation, and in order to identify the problems that arise before the courts of first instance and the courts of appeals in consideration of the war crimes cases, the Supreme Court monitors statistics in our courts of the country and identifies systemic problems in the application of war crimes clauses, so that we are able to provide all courts with assistance, both the first instance and the courts of appeals. For example, during this monitoring, we found that almost all problems occur under the Article 438, violation of laws and customs of war. And the Parliament determined that the violation of the laws and customs should be understood, for example, as cruel treatment of prisoners of war or civilians, looting of national values in the occupied territory. But at the same time, it's an open list indicating that other violations of international conventions can be also considered. The question is how to clarify what is cruel treatment, what is the prisoner of war, what is civilian population, expulsion of the civilian population, forced labor, looting, etc. Also, it requires reference to the international humanitarian law, but also we need to establish what is meant by other violations of the law and customs of war. For the qualification of judges, they are trying to independently form various tables and lists of international conventions and the violations of which should be considered when we consider such cases. It's important that courts correctly apply the criminal legislation of Ukraine in relation to the international humanitarian law. The whole world should understand that Ukraine clearly complies to the international law and practice established by international courts. We feel a lot of support in training of judges of all instances by our international partners. For example, in Warsaw, Poland, 90 judges were trained recently specifically on the application of international humanitarian law in the war crimes cases. Ensuring effective trial of war crimes is one of the main tasks for our system of justice, which will require in particular improvement of the procedure for such trials. For example, we focus on the fact that the procedure for notifying participants in criminal trials with the use of international elements, including in different languages, is to be improved. The second challenge is about the shortage of the judicial personnel in Ukraine. This arose due to various reasons long before the war. The relevant staffing problems were caused in particular by the incomplete appraisal of judges of the first instance. The need to change the network, of course, in accordance to the reform of the territories and administrative system in Ukraine. The absence of the Supreme Council of Justice and non-implementation of the activities of the verdicts of the Supreme Council of Justice. In accordance with the law of Ukraine on the legal regime of martial law, the justice in the territory where the martial law has been imposed is carried out only by courts. No abbreviation or acceleration of judicial trial is allowed. In conditions of the legal regime of martial law, the courts act exclusively within the limit of their authority and in the manner determined by the Constitution and the laws of Ukraine. At the end of 2022, the number of judges that were determined by the order of Ukrainian Act was 6,278 judges. And the number of judges who administrative judges in 2022 was 404,434. So it means that only 70% of the required amount. So in December 2022, the shortage of judges in local and courts of appeal amounted to almost 2,000 judges, and the shortage of judges in local courts about 1,000 judges, 28%. The situation is even worse with the courts of appeal, where the shortage of judges is about 42%. The decrease in the number of courts where justice is administered is also a problem, because there is not only shortage of judges, but also a lower number of courts. And this increases the burden on the courts and on judges, and this affects the efficiency and quality of handling cases, including those related to the war crimes. In addition, the judicial system was challenged by a number of destroyed and damaged court premises, and the need for many judges to relocate and move to an unoccupied part of Ukraine. There were also, unfortunately, deaths of judges and court staff living in captivity, etc. The launch of judicial appointment agencies can overcome these challenges in the judicial system in the near future. But there is also the third challenge, which is related to the fact that some courts cannot administer justice due to the temporary occupation of the territory of Ukraine where they act. So with the participation of the Supreme Court, the law of Ukraine on amending the law on the judiciary and the status of judges was adopted to determine the territorial jurisdiction of court cases. So the law was adopted in March 2022, and it amended the relevant part of the law on the judiciary and the status of judges. It provided that in the event of impossibility of administering justice in a court for objective reasons during martial law, the territorial jurisdiction of the court cases may be changed by order of the chairman, or the president, I should say, of the Supreme Court, in case of impossibility of exercising such authority by the High Council of Justice. So the corresponding decision is the basis for transfer of all cases pending before the court where the jurisdiction changes. And according to the orders of the President of the Supreme Court, in the beginning of January 2023, the jurisdiction of court cases of 130 courts of general jurisdiction and 36 courts of in particular Autonomous Republic of Crimea was changed in terms of the territorial jurisdiction. So now we have subsequently restored the territorial jurisdiction to 51 courts of general jurisdiction, and today there are also problems regarding the return of materials of criminal trials to the courts where territorial jurisdiction changed and then subsequently was restored. In particular, there is no automatic allowance in the law to return criminal cases to those courts where the territorial jurisdiction was restored. So after the declaration of martial law in Ukraine, the courts of Ukraine faced really many challenges and difficulties of organizational, personnel, material and technical and other nature. The format of the work of courts and judges has undergone significant changes in this period. But more and more courts are adapting to function in these new temporary conditions of martial law, and judges continue to work for effective administration of justice. Thank you so much.
Very much, Justice Kravchenko. I think the audience will recognize how lucky we are to have a contribution from the Chief Justice, the President of the Supreme Court, particularly since he's only been in office for a little over a month. And it wasn't possible to have a transcript of his remarks in English before you now. This event has been recorded, and I think it will be wise for us to seek to get a transcript to place on the website so that those who are interested can see more easily what was been said and what we've had translated impromptu, for which we are very grateful. So thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to, before we close, see if there are one or two more questions that the audience would like to ask. I think we clearly have Mr. Simon Smith here. We do have Justice Kravchenko, and it may be we could translate a question. And I think we also may have Mr. Kostin still online. Are there any more questions? Well, you had your chance. May I thank you again, Justice Kravchenko, and Mr. Kostin, if you are online, and to Simon Smith, who's present. And thank you very much to all of you for attending. We will call it to a conclusion there. Thank you very much indeed.